I think it is possible that some ideas of mine on the subject of the treatment of steel may be of interest, but I do not make these remarks for the purpose of attacking any opinions that have been advanced on this matter by others. My purpose is to simply call attention to some important facts which appear to have been unknown or overlooked by the advocates of certain methods of treating steel. Hello everyone, welcome back to the workshop. Today I'm going to be reading a very interesting passage on the treating of steel in the book Practical Blacksmithing. I've read this book cover to cover, and I was reading it again last night, and I found this passage, and I thought it was quite interesting. This book was written at the turn of the century, back whenever heat treating steel was much more of an art than it is today. And while in modern times, with modern steels, there are very scientific methods of heat treating steel, many of us are still using found steel or junkyard steel. So these methods are still quite applicable. The author goes on to write more about the heat treating of steel. One very interesting portion is he writes, "These rules will, however, apply in every case. Try to learn the lowest heat at which each particular steel will harden sufficiently to do the work for which it is intended, and never exceed that heat. Harden at a heat which calls for no drawing down to a blue to remove brittleness. Hardened at the proper heat, steel is stronger without drawing the temper than it is before hardening. Whenever hardened steel snaps off like glass at a little tap, and shows a grain as coarse or coarser than it showed before hardening, don't say it is too hard, but say it was too hot. Steel is hardened by the heating to the proper heat and cooling suddenly. Good results can never be obtained by heating steel too hot for sudden cooling, and then cooling in some mixture or compound which will cool the overheated steel more gradually." I think this is very interesting personally. I do use this method for many of my chisels and other tools. I don't think that these methods really apply to knives. Knives are a very different beast with very different sort of different desirable characteristics for the steel, whereas tools, you really want them to remain hard, abrasion resistant, and sharp. In the case of a fuller cannot be sharp, but it can retain its shape in the same way that an edge can retain its shape. What he says here is to not heat your steel too much. Heating your steel too much, hardening it, and then tempering it, it's not as good as heating it up to a very specific temperature, a lower temperature, and then hardening it, and then tempering it very little. That is a better method. He goes on to write, "First of all, never heat steel in any fire except a charcoal fire or a lead bath which gives it a uniform heat. I mean steel tools of any kind." He's meaning don't heat treat your steel in any fire that is not uniform. Back then it would have been a charcoal fire or a lead bath. "Rainwater is the best water for hardening, as it contains less lime than either well or river water. Water should never be very cold for hardening tools, as the sudden contraction of the steel will cause it to crack, more especially in cutting dies, where there are sharp corners. To ensure thorough hardness, salt should be added to the water until the same becomes quite brackish. The salt will cause the water to take hold of the steel and cool it off gradually. I find rock or fish salt to be the best, although table salt will answer. The salt is also beneficial to the carbon in the steel." I think this information is very interesting. I personally don't use rainwater in my quench tank, but I do use lots of salt, and I've had very good results from it. It cools steel off very quickly, but it seems to have a better result than just straight water. It also doesn't freeze, and also another advantage is there's no algae to speak of, or any bugs, really. There's no bugs, no nothing like that, because it's salt water. They can't really live in it. Another interesting passage refers to the hardening of drop hammer dies. He shows a essentially a tub with water in it. Well, I'll show a photo here. The passage reads as follows. To harden a heavy die, proceed as follows. Get a uniform bright red heap on the steel, then place it in the water tub with the face of the die in the water. The steel being supported in the tub by the two hangers FF as shown in figure 10. C indicates the water's edge and depth and shows the position of the die in the water. Before placing the die on the hangers, be sure to have two hangers in their proper places and have the water supply pipe turned on with full force, and be sure that the die is placed directly over the middle of the supply pipe at D. We will say that the die, B in figure 10, is 10 by 5 by 6 inches. A bulk steel like this will heat much water, and therefore, while the supply pipe furnishes cold water, the waste pipe carries off all the warm or the hot or warm water as fast as the steel heats it. In figure 11, the cut also shows how the die is placed at an angle in the water. The best way to harden trimming dies is always to examine thoroughly the die before you dip it and turn it while it is dipping so as all the thick or heavy parts enter the water first. The best mode for hardening punches is to harden them first in cold water, then draw the temper to suit the work they are intended for. While the die is hanging in the tub, as in figure 10, it would do no harm to utilize a tin cup in pouring water on the bottom of the die, which is out of the water. I've seen hundreds of blocks of steel hardened this way to the best of successes. I never have to the temper drawn for drop hammer dies. The harder you can get them, the better. It's very interesting in my opinion. Many people, to harden large dies, they don't do the same thing. I do see these methods employed in the Middle East, in Middle Eastern blacksmiths, mostly with hammers. They'll have tubs of running water with little hangers. They'll place the hammer eye on it, and the running water will run over the face of the hammer. I think that if you do a lot of hardening of large blocks of steel, then building a tub like this would be quite beneficial. And frankly, even if you only have to harden one or two dies, or one or two large blocks of steel, maybe you're making a homemade anvil or something like that, making a tub like this would be quite easy. I know with anvils they did something that is very similar, except they would have the water running over the top of it rather than essentially a tub that is constantly being filled and drained. These methods for hardening steel are, some might say they're outdated, but I personally don't think that they are. I think that the old methods for hardening steel are quite interesting, and many of this information is still applicable. Lead baths and salt baths that they used to use, I don't really think that we can do that much anymore. We can, of course, but there are, of course, dangers to doing so. I think that modern propane forges are good supplements for these salt baths and lead baths that they used to use. That and electric kilns are also an excellent substitute for those. Well, those were those excerpts on the subject of hardening steel at the turn of the century. I'm sorry I didn't read everything. There was an incredible amount of information, but many of it, or a lot of it, is kind of repeated. This book is essentially, once again, this book is a collection of stories. Many of these passages were not written by the author, but were compiled by the author. Many of these are from different many of the passages and paragraphs are from different shop foremans, which is why sometimes you'll see conflicting information. A passage says that this is the best way to do this, and another passage says that this is the best way to do this. In any case, it is still an amazing resource for information. There are excerpts on anvil repair, forge building, shop layout, the repair of different tools, hammer making, tool making, the forge welding, almost anything. Not quite anything. I wish there was some more information on industrial forging in this book. I need to pick up a book on industrial forging. But for the home blacksmith, it's still very valid information. It's an amazing book, and I suggest if you are interested in metalworking at all, even if you're not a blacksmith, you should definitely pick up a copy and just start reading it. Even if you're just a machinist or a sheet metal worker or a welder, there's a lot of information in here that you can still use. And I think I'm going to end with that. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. It was a bit of a mix mash. And have a good day.